All right, so I want to talk to you today about policy capacity. Policy capacity. So, what does that mean? Well, policy capacity is the ability of governments to make choices that address public problems. And different states, we're going to talk about this in the state context, different states have different policy capacity. And a lot of that has to do with how professionalized their legislatures are. So, something we call legislative professionalism. And when you have legislative professionalism, there are some things that are present that signal that. So, with legislative professionalism, you usually see more time in session. So, different states have their state legislature in session for different periods of time. More professionalized legislatures, like a California or Pennsylvania, will have their legislature in session a lot. Less professionalized legislatures, like Nebraska or Georgia, will be in session a lot less. This creates less time to work on creating policy. So you're in session less if you're less professionalized. You're in session more if you have a more professionalized legislature. What also comes with that is that your legislators in professionalized settings uh, have higher pay. So because you're in session more and because there's more work to creating policy, you have higher pay for your legislators. So uh, in a state like um, in a state like Ohio, your legislators get paid, but they don't get paid a really high salary that allows those people to simply quit their day job. I would say Ohio is kind of in the middle of the professionalism scale. Nebraska, that legislature is they meet very little, they get paid very little. Georgia legislator makes I think $15,000 a year. It's basically a stipend, and they're not in session very often. In Ohio, the last I heard, it was $40,000 a year or so, which isn't terrible, but a lot of these folks that are in these positions and elected these positions work higher paying jobs than that they're not willing to give up in order to spend all of their time working on policy. So when you have more professionalized legislatures, you have more time in session, you have higher pay for those legislators, and that gives them the ability to focus only on making policy for the state. When you have more professionalized legislatures, you also have more staff. So each of these legislators then have more staff to help them. There are more lawyers available, although many of them are lawyers. There are more resources available to help them craft policy, which also then leads to more expertise. More professionalized legislatures have um, more expertise. They spend more time working on their craft, which is creating policy. So they start to become experts in certain policy areas. Not everything, of course, but whatever. If they're on committees, whatever. If they're on the education committee, they become an expert on education policy because they're spending a lot of time working in that area. So that so this is part of policy capacity, this legislative professionalism, because it gives the state resources that it needs to write and pass legislation. But there's another part to this too. There's bureaucratic. I'm going to abbreviate that for the purposes. There's bureaucratic capacity. And so this is how big is your bureaucracy? How your ability to implement is part of your policy capacity. So how are you going to implement the law? Because you can have a really highly professionalized legislature, but if you don't have the bureaucratic capacity to implement the policies that are being passed by the legislature, then you don't have the policy capacity. You don't have this. Because you can here's a kind of a mundane example that we would never think about because every state has these requirements. But let's just say the state passes a law. Well, let's say we don't have driver's licenses because at some point we probably didn't because cars were less prevalent. If we didn't have driver's licenses, the state says a legislature can come up with a really complex policy that says, okay, we're going to have all these requirements for driver's licenses. These are the kinds of tests you're going to have to pass, and the state is going to issue you the license once you pass the test. But if you don't have the bureaucratic capacity, you can pass that policy that says we're going to issue driver's licenses to everybody who passes the test, and you have to have a driver's license to drive on the roads. But if you don't have the people at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles to issue those licenses, you don't have the capacity to do so. If you need the Department of Motor Vehicles or the Bureau of Motor Vehicles to issue those licenses. If you don't have the staff to do so, you can't implement that policy. And then you really don't have the policy capacity to solve the problem of keeping reckless drivers off the road and making sure there's a minimum standard for how someone is able to drive a car. And so this brings me to something else that I want to talk about in this video related to policy capacity, and that's copy and paste lawmaking. So with copy and paste lawmaking, this is when one state decides to take a law from another state, and they barely change anything. They just copy and paste it, and then they pass the law. This is a lot of how these policies spread is through something called policy diffusion. When one state adopts a policy, they choose to innovate. Other states look at that policy and they decide to either emulate it or imitate it. They decide that's a good idea. We should do that too. So think about states that legalize marijuana. Colorado did it first, and then other states looked at possibly the tax revenue or public opinion or losing revenue as people crossed the border to go buy marijuana in Colorado, and other states decided, we're missing an opportunity here, we should do this too. Same thing with like gambling, casino gambling. West Virginia adopts a gambling policy, and then the states around it start adopting it. Ohio adopted gambling legislation when they put it up for a referendum, but that policy diffused. It started someplace and it diffuses. It spreads throughout. It gets passed in one spot, and then other states starting adopting it for various reasons. When it came to gambling, you had a lot of people leaving Ohio to go gamble across the border, and there was a thought, well, why don't we just keep this business in Ohio? So there are positives and negatives to this copy and paste lawmaking. So let's talk a little bit about the positives and the negatives. So a positive. Actually, let's talk about the negatives first. So the negatives, these aren't original. It's not this romanticized idea of the legislative process where You have a policymaker, a legislator that says, this is a good idea. I'm going to write a bill. Um, you know, it's not original. These solutions in other states might not work for your state, and so it's there's a thought that it's better to come up with your own policies than it is to just copy off of somebody else. This also creates more influence from outside groups. So outside groups then have more influence over the process, as you've read about. Um, because we have these less professionalized legislatures that don't have the time to put in the effort to make the policies, so outside groups come in with their model legislation, they pass it in one state, another state then takes it and copies and pastes it, and they pass it, and all of a sudden you have this policy that has diffused through the states, and this creates this pressure from outside groups to adopt policies. And so one of the negatives is it doesn't come from, these ideas aren't coming from the people in your state necessarily. They're coming from people in other states. And that means, the final point, and I already mentioned this a little bit, it may not be a good fit for your state. And that could be part of the problem, is that just because some other state does it doesn't mean that you should do it. And you should come up with solutions that are specific to your state. However, there are so those are some criticisms. There are some positives here. The positive here, the big one, is that this allows states with fewer resources to pass legislation. This allows states with fewer resources to pass legislation. So those states that only meet once every other year, or they don't pay their legislators very much, they're very deprofessionalized, they don't have the time and the resources to write complicated legislation. So they can look at another state's legislation and go, hey, that might be a good fit for us. Let's just take it and we'll adapt it. They don't usually copy it word for word. You adapt it to your state a little bit. We'll take that idea and we'll run with it. And so really, the smaller states or the less professionalized states look to the bigger states or the more professionalized states for ideas. And the other positive here that's related is it's more efficient. There are so many things that aren't efficient about the democratic process. This is more efficient. If you want to legalize marijuana, why would you start from scratch if another state has already passed that legislation? Look at the other state's legislation and pass similar legislation. There's no sense in reinventing the wheel. So those are some positives and negatives about copy and paste lawmaking, and how policy capacity plays a role in the policies that our states implement.